The pregnancy test was shaking in his fingers when I walked into the office that morning. And the moment our eyes met, I knew my entire life was about to fall apart. Care to explain this, Clyde? Vincent Sheridan's voice was flat, controlled, the same tone he used when closing a $1 million deal in front of nervous investors. But his hand was trembling, just slightly, just enough that I noticed. I had never once seen Vincent's hand tremble in 2 years of working beside him. Not during hostile takeovers, not during board disputes that lasted until 2 in the morning, not even the time a supplier threatened to sue the company into bankruptcy. This single object had managed what none of that ever could. I stood frozen in the doorway of his office, my heart slamming against my ribs so hard I thought he could hear it across the room. The plastic stick caught the morning light pouring in through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him, and those 2 faint pink lines seemed to glow brighter than anything else in that pristine glass-walled office. Everything in that room was usually so orderly, so deliberate, arranged exactly the way Vincent liked it. This one small thing had thrown the entire balance off completely. "Where did you find that?" My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to, almost a whisper swallowed by the hum of the building's ventilation system. "In my trash bin," he said slowly, watching my face for any flicker of a reaction. "Which means it didn't come from my apartment, Clyde. It came from somewhere inside this building. Somewhere close enough to end up in my office without anyone noticing." He set it down carefully on his desk, like it was evidence laid out for a trial, and in many ways I suppose that's exactly what it had become. "So I am only going to ask you this once more. Whose is it?" I had been Vincent Sheridan's personal assistant for exactly 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days. I knew the number because I tracked everything for him obsessively. His meetings, his flights, the way his coffee order shifted depending on his mood, the precise temperature he preferred his office kept at during the colder months. I knew the rhythm of his life better than I understood my own most days. What I had never planned for, not once in those 2 years, was a single reckless night that broke every careful boundary I had constructed between us. It happened at the company's annual gala, 3 weeks earlier. Too much champagne, too much proximity in a crowded ballroom, and an alpha scent wrapping around me like gravity. I had no real defense against. We told ourselves the next morning, over rushed coffee and averted eyes, that it had meant nothing. That we would simply return to schedules and polite distance as though nothing had shifted between us at all. We lied to ourselves so convincingly that I had almost believed it myself, right up until 2 mornings ago, when I stood alone in my bathroom and watched my entire future rearrange itself in the span of 3 unbearable minutes. I had wrapped that test carefully in a paper towel at home, fully intending to dispose of it properly, privately, somewhere it would never resurface to haunt me. Instead, in my exhaustion and panic, I had shoved it into the side pocket of my work bag without thinking it through, planning to deal with it later when my hands stopped shaking. That morning, while clearing out old folders at my own desk, it must have slipped loose unnoticed and landed somewhere near Vincent's private bin, the one he insisted on emptying himself, a strange personal habit born from not wanting to burden the cleaning staff with anything touching his confidential documents. Of all the small, particular routines Vincent Sheridan had built into his life, that single detail had just quietly destroyed mine. "It's a mistake," I said, looking anywhere but at his face, at the floor, at the window, anywhere that wasn't those sharp gray eyes studying me like I was a problem he hadn't yet solved. "It doesn't matter whose it is. It matters to me." His jaw tightened visibly, and something flickered behind his composed expression that wasn't anger at all. It looked closer to fear, though I couldn't imagine what a man like Vincent Sheridan, with his empire and his reputation and his untouchable confidence, possibly had left to fear. "Were you simply never going to tell me? Was I meant to find out by sorting through garbage like some stranger?" The cruelty buried inside his question wasn't aimed at wounding me. I realized slowly, it was aimed at himself, punishing himself for not noticing sooner, for not being the kind of man who paid close enough attention to the people standing closest to him every single day. I backed away instinctively, until the cool glass of his office wall pressed firmly against my shoulder blades, offering nowhere left to retreat. His scent reached me then, woods and rain and something distinctly and only his, and my omega instinct screamed at me to close the distance between us rather than flee it. Every cell in my body wanted to surrender completely, to tell him everything without restraint, to let him fold me into his arms the way I had quietly dreamed about for far longer than I would ever admit aloud to another living soul. But my mind screamed louder, drowning out every weaker impulse. If he discovered the full truth of how I felt, he wouldn't choose me freely. He would choose obligation instead. He would keep me only because of what was now growing inside me, never because of who I actually was as a person. The door opened before either of us could say another word. Elmer Lang stepped inside holding a thick stack of contracts against his chest, his easy, familiar smile dissolving instantly the moment he registered the tension thick enough to choke on. "Everything all right in here?" His eyes moved quickly from Vincent's clenched fist resting on the desk to my pale, trembling face, and something in his expression sharpened immediately with genuine concern. Neither of us answered him directly. Vincent didn't even glance away from me, his attention fixed entirely on the answer he was still waiting for. "Clyde," he said again, slower this time, almost gently, like he was offering me a way out I didn't believe I deserved. "Is this child mine?" The question hung suspended in the air between us, heavier than anything I had ever carried in my entire life. I thought briefly about lying, about inventing some elaborate story that might shield me from whatever came next. But standing there, with his eyes locked unwaveringly on mine and Elmer watching us both like he already understood more than either of us had said out loud, I realized there was no version of this moment where deception could possibly save me. "Yes," I whispered. The silence that followed wasn't empty at all. It was full of unspoken accusations, full of 2 years of carefully buried feelings neither of us had dared name, full of an uncertain future neither of us had asked for, but both of us now had to face together, whether we wanted to or not. Vincent's expression didn't shift dramatically. He simply nodded once, slowly as though confirming something he had already quietly suspected and dreaded confirming. "Elmer," he said without turning around, his voice steady despite everything churning beneath it, "give us the room." Elmer hesitated only a second before backing out reluctantly, the contract still clutched tightly against his chest, his eyes lingering on me with a silent promise that we would talk later, that he wasn't simply going to disappear and forget what he had just witnessed. The door clicked shut softly behind him, and somehow that small sound felt like it had sealed something irreversible between Vincent and me, something neither of us could undo no matter how badly we might want to. I expected shouting. I expected him to dismiss me on the spot, to call security, to do anything that matched the cold, calculated authority he was known for in every boardroom across the city. Instead, he turned slowly toward the window, his back to me now, his shoulders rigid with something I couldn't immediately name. 2 years, he said quietly, almost to himself, his reflection faint in the glass. 2 years of you organizing every single detail of my life, and I had no idea you were carrying something this enormous, completely alone. I didn't want you to feel trapped, I admitted, my voice finally breaking on the last word. He turned back to face me then, and the look on his face wasn't rage at all. It was something far more dangerous to my already fragile heart. It was devastation, raw and unguarded. "Trapped," he repeated, like the word tasted wrong in his mouth. "Is that truly what you believed I would feel?" I had no answer prepared for him. All I had was the undeniable truth sitting between us on his desk, 2 pink lines that had already rewritten everything I thought I understood about my own future, and a silence stretching endlessly that told me nothing about this would ever be simple again. The silence in his office didn't break when I finally left. It followed me down the hallway, into the elevator, all the way back to my desk where I sat staring blankly at my monitor without actually seeing anything displayed on the screen in front of me. I kept replaying his face over and over in my mind. Not the anger I had fully braced myself for walking in there, but that brief flicker of devastation, like I had somehow wounded him simply by trying to protect him from a truth he deserved to know. It made absolutely no sense to me at the time. Alphas like Vincent Sheridan didn't get devastated over their assistants getting pregnant. They got inconvenienced, they got irritated, maybe embarrassed by the scandal it might cause. They didn't look like their entire foundation had just cracked wide open in front of them. By early afternoon, he called me back into his office through a brief clipped message sent by his secretary. This time the door was already standing open when I arrived, and he was positioned by the window with his hands buried deep in his pockets, his posture stiff in a way that told me he had spent the last several hours rehearsing whatever he was about to say to me. "Sit," he said, not unkindly, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. I sat, smoothing my hands over my knees to keep them from shaking visibly. "Tell me about the gala," he said finally. "Not the version everyone else remembers, the parts you actually remember, Clyde." My throat tightened immediately. The annual gala had taken place exactly 3 weeks and 2 days before that moment, though I doubted he had been counting the days the same obsessive way I had. I remembered the champagne burning warm down my throat that night. Remembered laughing freely at something he said that genuinely wasn't even that funny. Remembered the way his hand had settled naturally at the small of my back as we left the crowded ballroom together. Completely unplanned, completely unspoken between us until the very moment it happened. We told each other afterward that it didn't mean anything, I said carefully, choosing each word with deliberate caution. The next morning, over coffee neither of us actually drank. We agreed to forget it ever happened and move forward like normal. I never forgot it, he said quietly, and the admission seemed to cost him something significant to say out loud. I just convinced myself that I had to forget it, because you worked directly for me, and because crossing that particular line would have made absolutely everything between us unbearably complicated. It's complicated now, regardless of what either of us wanted, I said, gesturing weakly toward my own stomach, toward the undeniable truth that had already rearranged both our lives, whether either of us felt ready for it or not. He sat down across from me instead of retreating behind his desk, an unusual choice for a man who typically used furniture as a deliberate barrier between himself and the rest of the world. Were you ever actually going to tell me, Clyde? If I hadn't stumbled upon that test by accident, what exactly was your plan? The question stung sharply because I genuinely didn't have a good answer prepared for it. I thought about raising the baby completely alone. Quietly, without involving you at all. Maybe even relocating somewhere far enough that your family would never make the connection back to you. You were going to disappear entirely, he said flatly. And the hurt buried in his voice was unmistakable now. Raw in a way I hadn't expected from someone usually so composed. You were going to take my child and simply vanish without ever giving me the chance to be part of either of your lives. Because I assumed you would only want to be involved out of obligation, I said, my voice cracking under the weight of finally saying it out loud. I assumed that if I told you, you would propose marriage purely out of duty, not because you genuinely wanted me as a person. I didn't want to spend years of my life wondering whether you secretly regretted choosing me. He stood up abruptly, running a frustrated hand through his hair, tension radiating off him in waves that made the entire room feel charged with electricity. Do you have any concept of how insulting that assumption actually is? You decided exactly what I would feel before I even had a fair chance to feel it myself. I didn't know what else to think. I admitted honestly. You're a Sheridan, Vincent. Your family expects someone polished, someone from the correct social circles, not an assistant who answers your phone calls and arranges your dry cleaning pickups. My family doesn't get to decide who I love, he said, and the word landed between us like a struck match catching fire. He clearly hadn't meant to say it so directly. I could tell by the way his eyes widened slightly afterward, but it was already out now, hanging suspended in the air with absolutely no way to take it back. I didn't trust myself to respond to that. Instead, I stood quickly gathering whatever composure I still had left, and walked out of his office before either of us said something neither of us felt ready to face yet. That evening in the parking garage beneath our building, Elmer caught up with me as I fumbled clumsily with my car keys, my hands shaking from exhaustion more than from the cold evening air. You look like you survived an actual war in there today, he said, falling easily into step beside me. He knows everything now, I told him quietly, about the baby, about the gala, about all of it. Elmer's eyebrows shot upward in surprise. And he didn't fire you on the spot for it? No, I said, still surprised at how strange that fact felt saying it out loud. He just looked completely wrecked, like I had hurt him somehow by trying to protect him. Maybe, Elmer said carefully, leaning his weight against my car door. He actually cares about you deeply, Clyde. Maybe this entire situation isn't about obligation at all. Or maybe, I said, finally unlocking the door, I'm about to ruin both our lives completely by letting myself believe that's true. I drove home that night with my chest tight and my thoughts considerably louder than the radio I had completely forgotten to turn on. When I finally reached my apartment and collapsed onto my couch, exhausted beyond words, my phone lit up sharply on the coffee table beside me. Vincent's name flashed across the screen, and my stomach dropped before I had even managed to answer the call. Come to my place tonight, he said. No greeting offered. No hesitation in his voice at all. We need to talk about this properly, somewhere private, not in an office, not with anyone listening through the door. Vincent, I don't think that's... Please. The word landed soft and unfamiliar coming from him, stripped completely of his usual commanding authority. I need you to hear everything I have to say without a desk standing between us this time. I sat there holding the phone long after the call had already ended, staring blankly at the ceiling above me, wondering what kind of conversation could possibly be waiting on the other side of that door, and whether I was actually brave enough to walk into it willingly. I stood outside Vincent's apartment door far longer than I probably should have, my hand hovering uncertainly over the buzzer while every possible version of this conversation played out repeatedly through my exhausted mind. When the door finally opened, nothing I had imagined beforehand prepared me for what I saw waiting inside. His living room, usually pristine and impersonal like an upscale hotel suite, was scattered everywhere with papers, medical pamphlets specifically about omega pregnancies, printed articles covering prenatal care in exhaustive detail, a yellow notepad filled entirely with his own handwriting listing things like "find the best obstetrician in the city" and "ask Clyde what he actually wants, don't simply assume." "What is all of this?" I asked quietly, stepping carefully over a folder that had slipped loose onto the floor near my feet. He looked almost embarrassed, an expression so completely foreign on his face that it stopped me dead in my tracks. "I didn't want you walking in here thinking I hadn't prepared for any of this properly. I didn't want you assuming I was only reacting out of pure panic." My chest ached in a way I genuinely wasn't ready for. "Vincent, I don't need an entire folder full of medical research. I just need to know you're not doing any of this because you feel trapped by circumstances outside your control. Is that honestly what worries you the most right now?" he asked, closing the remaining distance between us until I could feel the warmth radiating naturally from his body. "Yes," I admitted, my voice barely rising above a whisper. "I'm terrified you'll keep me around only because of the baby growing inside me. That underneath all of this careful preparation, there's no real genuine feeling for me, just a heavy sense of responsibility you can't escape." He reached out slowly, tilting my chin upward gently, so I had no choice but to meet his eyes directly. "Clyde, I have wanted you for so much longer than that single night at the gala. I simply never said anything because I assumed you only saw me as your employer, someone you merely tolerated because your entire paycheck depended on it." My breath caught somewhere deep in my throat. "You wanted me even before that night happened. For far longer than I'm proud to admit out loud," he confessed, his thumb brushing softly along the curve of my jaw. "I used to invent ridiculous reasons just to keep you in the office later than necessary, simply so I could have more time near you. I told myself repeatedly it was purely about efficiency. It was never actually about efficiency at all." The confession hit me harder than I had expected it to, unraveling every careful defense I had constructed around my own buried feelings for him over these past 2 years. "I thought I was the only one drowning quietly in all of this," I whispered. "You weren't," he said gently, his forehead dropping softly against mine. "You were never alone in any of this, Clyde. I simply hid my own feelings badly, worse than I realized." We stood together in comfortable silence for a long moment, nothing but the steady sound of our breathing filling the space between us, every unspoken feeling from the past 2 years finally rising completely to the surface between us. When he eventually pulled back slightly, his eyes searched mine with an unvoiced question he didn't need to say aloud for me to understand it clearly. "I love you," I said, the words slipping free before I could properly second-guess myself. "I have for a long time now, Vincent. I just never believed it was something I was actually allowed to say out loud to you." His expression softened in a way I had genuinely never witnessed once in 2 full years of working closely beside him, every sharp, guarded edge of the powerful businessman dissolving completely into something achingly tender and vulnerable. He pulled me carefully into his arms, and for the very first time since discovering I was pregnant, I felt something close to actual peace settle gently over my entire body. The moment didn't last quite long enough. His phone buzzed sharply against the coffee table nearby, breaking the fragile stillness we had only just managed to build together. He sighed softly against my hair before reluctantly pulling away to check the screen. "My mother," he said, his expression shifting almost instantly into something far more guarded and tense. "She's invited the both of us to a formal family dinner this coming weekend." My stomach dropped immediately at the words. "Us? Vincent, does she already know about the baby?" "Not yet," he admitted, setting the phone back down carefully on the table. "But she will need to know soon enough. I refuse to let you walk into that house completely unprepared, and I absolutely will not let my family treat you like some shameful secret to be hidden away." "They won't accept me, Vincent," I said quietly, the fear I had been carrying since this all began, finally surfacing completely into the open between us. "I'm not from their world. I'm the person who schedules your meetings and answers your calls, not someone they would ever picture standing proudly beside you at a family dinner." He took both of my hands firmly in his own, his grip steady and reassuring despite the visible tension building noticeably in his shoulders. I don't care what world you originally came from, Clyde. I care only about the truth, and the truth is that I love you completely and we're having a child together. My family will simply have to learn to accept that reality, whether they like it initially or not, and if they refuse to accept it, I asked carefully. His jaw tightened with a resolve I hadn't witnessed since the very moment he first confronted me inside his office. Then they'll learn exactly what it costs to underestimate you, because I already know precisely how strong you truly are underneath all that quiet fear. I wanted desperately to believe him completely, but as I drove home later that night, his words still echoing steadily through my mind, I couldn't quite shake the growing dread settling deep within my chest. Whatever waited for us at that upcoming family dinner, I had a strong feeling it would test every single fragile piece of hope we had only just begun, carefully building together. The Sheridan estate looked exactly the way I had imagined it would beforehand. Imposing, immaculate, and entirely unwelcoming, with tall marble columns that seemed almost deliberately designed to remind every visitor exactly how small they truly were in comparison to the family's wealth and legacy. My hands trembled noticeably as Vincent guided me carefully through the grand front entrance, his palm pressed reassuringly against the small of my back the entire way inside. Martha Sheridan was already waiting patiently in the formal sitting room, dressed elegantly in a deep navy gown that probably cost more than my entire monthly salary combined. Her posture rigid with the kind of natural authority that filled entire rooms without her ever needing to raise her voice once. "So you're the one," she said slowly, her sharp eyes sweeping over me with calculated precision the moment we stepped into the room together. "The assistant who's apparently carrying my son's child inside you." "Mother," Vincent warned immediately, his voice sharp with unmistakable protectiveness, "you will treat Clyde with proper respect inside this house, regardless of your personal feelings." Martha's calculating gaze didn't waver from mine for even a second, though something briefly flickered behind her carefully composed expression. "I simply stated an obvious fact, Vincent. There's no inherent disrespect contained within plain honesty." Dinner unfolded slowly like a carefully disguised interrogation hidden behind polite conversation. Martha asked pointed questions about my family background, my limited education, my modest financial situation, each question delivered with the calculated precision of someone methodically building a legal case rather than genuinely getting to know someone her son cared deeply about. I answered every question honestly, refusing to embellish anything at all, even as her expression grew increasingly skeptical with each response I gave. "I confess I genuinely don't understand," she finally said, setting down her wine glass with deliberate, measured calm. "Vincent could have his choice of any omega from the most respected and established families across this entire city. Why would he possibly settle for someone employed merely to manage his daily schedule? Because I love him completely," Vincent said immediately, his voice carrying none of his usual diplomatic restraint or careful business polish. "That's really not a complicated concept to grasp, Mother, regardless of how you might wish it were." Martha's laugh was sharp and entirely devoid of genuine warmth. "Love doesn't sustain family legacies, Vincent. Love certainly doesn't protect a family name that has taken 3 full generations of careful effort to properly build." Something inside me finally broke completely free from the careful, measured silence I had maintained throughout the entire evening up to that point. "Mrs. Sheridan, I'm not remotely interested in your family's legacy or your son's prestigious name. I never once asked for either of those things from him." My voice shook visibly, but I refused to let that stop me from finishing. "All I genuinely want is to love your son fully and raise our child together with complete honesty. If that simply isn't enough for you, I sincerely understand, but I refuse to apologize for who I am as a person." The entire dining room fell into stunned, heavy silence. Martha studied me carefully for a long, deeply uncomfortable moment, something shifting subtly behind her composed exterior, though I genuinely couldn't yet tell which direction that internal shift was actually taking her. "You're not afraid of me," she said eventually, and it wasn't really phrased as a question at all. "I am afraid," I admitted honestly, holding her gaze steadily, "but I'm considerably more afraid of raising my child believing that love should ever be hidden away or apologized for. That particular fear outweighs my fear of you entirely." Vincent reached for my hand beneath the table, his grip firm and wonderfully grounding, and for the first time that entire evening I felt genuinely steady rather than like I was slowly drowning in completely unfamiliar territory. After dinner concluded, as we walked slowly toward the front door together, Martha unexpectedly caught my arm gently, an unexpected gesture that startled me considerably. "You possess more courage than most people who ever walk through that particular door," she said quietly, her tone difficult to fully read. "I'll need some time to properly adjust to all of this, Clyde. But I won't pretend you didn't earn a measure of my genuine respect here tonight. It wasn't full acceptance. Not completely, but it was considerably more than I had dared to hope for." Walking in there earlier, Vincent squeezed my hand gently as we stepped outside into the cool evening air together, the visible tension in his shoulders finally beginning to ease slightly. "You handled that entire situation better than I could have ever imagined," he said, opening the car door carefully for me. "I was utterly terrified the entire time," I admitted, sliding gratefully into the passenger seat beside him. "You never once showed it," he said, settling himself behind the wheel. "You stood your ground exactly the way I somehow knew you would, even when I wasn't entirely sure myself how tonight would actually unfold between us." The drive home felt noticeably lighter than I had expected, like we had survived something together that neither of us fully understood the true weight of until it was safely behind us. We were laughing softly together about something trivial, the kind of easy, comfortable conversation we had never once allowed ourselves before all of this began, when my phone suddenly buzzed sharply in my lap. An unfamiliar number flashed brightly across the screen. I answered without thinking it through, still smiling faintly from whatever Vincent had just said moments earlier. "Clyde Mercer," a woman's voice said smoothly, cold and deliberate, immediately stripping every bit of warmth from inside the car. "I know for a fact that your child isn't actually Vincent Sheridan's." My entire body went completely rigid in an instant. The phone nearly slipped from my numb fingers as ice spread rapidly through my chest. And beside me, Vincent's expression shifted instantly from relaxed contentment to sharp, focused concern. Sensing the dramatic change in me before I had even managed to speak a single word in response, my hand shook so violently that the phone nearly fell completely out of my lap, the woman's cold voice still echoing relentlessly inside my ears, long after she had already stopped speaking. "Who is this?" I managed to ask, though I already strongly suspected the answer wouldn't bring me any comfort whatsoever. "My name is Velma Frost," she said, each word delivered deliberately, almost satisfied with the chaos she was clearly causing. "I dated Vincent for nearly 2 full years, and I know exactly what kind of person climbs the corporate ladder by getting pregnant entirely on purpose. Don't think for one second I won't expose you publicly for what you really are." I ended the call abruptly before she could continue speaking, my breathing ragged and uneven, my fingers completely numb against the phone's cold surface. Vincent pulled the car over almost immediately, his hand finding mine instinctively in the growing darkness of the front seat. "Clyde, what exactly happened? Please talk to me right now." I told him absolutely everything, my voice cracking repeatedly as I repeated Velma's exact words, watching his expression harden visibly with every single sentence until his jaw was set in that same way. I recognized clearly from our very first confrontation back in his office. "Velma," he said, almost spitting the name out like poison. "She's been desperately trying to manipulate her way back into my life for several months now. I should have anticipated that she would eventually target you the moment she somehow heard about the baby." She sounded completely certain, Vincent, certain enough to directly threaten me over the phone. "She's lying," he said firmly, gripping my hand even tighter than before. "I absolutely will not let her anywhere near you or our child ever. I promise you that completely." But promises, I would painfully learn over the following days, couldn't always move quickly enough to outrun chaos that had already been set into motion elsewhere. By the time I arrived at the office the following morning, an urgent message was already waiting for me from Human Resources, requesting my immediate presence in a private meeting room upstairs. I sat nervously across from the HR director, her expression carefully neutral as she explained that an anonymous complaint had been formally filed, alleging that I had deliberately pursued a relationship with Vincent, specifically to secure rapid career advancement, and that my pregnancy was apparently being used as calculated leverage against the company's senior executive leadership. "These are quite serious allegations," she said, sliding a printed document carefully across the table toward me. "We are required by company policy to investigate this thoroughly before reaching any conclusions." I stared down at the paper in complete disbelief, recognizing immediately the manipulative fingerprints hidden behind every carefully worded accusation listed there. "None of this is true. None of this happened anywhere close to the way it's described in this document. I understand this must be distressing for you," she replied evenly, though her tone clearly suggested she hadn't yet fully decided whether to believe my account of events. We'll need you to remain readily available for further questioning while we properly review all the evidence submitted to us. I left that uncomfortable meeting feeling like the solid ground beneath me had shifted entirely overnight. Every fragile piece of stability Vincent and I had carefully built together over the past few days, suddenly threatened by accusations I couldn't immediately disprove on my own. Elmer found me sitting at my desk roughly an hour later, his expression noticeably grim as he leaned heavily against the partition separating our two workspaces. "Clyde, there's something important you really need to see right now. Velma sent emails out to half the executive team late last night, complete with screenshots that looked disturbingly like private conversations between you and Vincent discussing the pregnancy as some kind of calculated leverage." My stomach turned violently at his words. "Those screenshots simply cannot be real, Elmer. I never once said any of those things to anyone." "I genuinely believe you," he said quickly. "But convincing everyone else here might prove considerably harder than you'd think. The timestamps look entirely legitimate, and people throughout the building are already talking about it." I found Vincent in his office staring intently at his computer screen, his expression a tense mixture of fury and disbelief that mirrored exactly what I was feeling internally. "I've already seen them," he said before I could even speak, his voice tight with carefully controlled rage. "There are private photographs mixed in there too, ones only Velma would have ever had access to from back when we were still together as a couple. Vincent, people throughout this entire building already think I'm only here because I deliberately trapped you into this situation," I said, my voice breaking completely under the crushing weight of everything collapsing around us so quickly. "Everything we just survived together at your mother's house suddenly feels completely pointless if I lose my reputation here at work." His eyes locked onto mine instantly, that familiar resolve hardening sharply across his handsome features. "Then I'll personally make absolutely sure everyone knows the complete truth. Starting right now, this very moment." He reached quickly for his phone, typing out a detailed message intended for every single executive on the leadership team, exposing Velma's manipulation directly and defending me publicly without any hesitation whatsoever. But the moment he pressed send firmly, an error message flashed sharply across his screen instead. "Email failed, account compromised." We stared at each other in stunned, heavy silence, the full weight of that single ominous sentence settling deeply between us. Velma hadn't simply spread lies through forwarded messages alone. She had infiltrated his entire system completely, and now neither of us had any real idea how deep her unauthorized access truly went, or what else she was fully prepared to manipulate before we could possibly manage to stop her. The IT department's server room felt unnervingly cold compared to the absolute chaos consuming the rest of the building that day. Fluorescent lights humming steadily overhead as three technicians worked frantically together to trace exactly how deeply Velma had managed to infiltrate Vincent's private accounts over time. "She installed backdoor access months ago," the lead technician explained carefully, scrolling rapidly through lines of code that meant absolutely nothing to me personally, but apparently told an entire detailed story to everyone else gathered in that room. "Most likely while she and Mr. Sheridan were still together as a couple. She's been quietly monitoring his communications ever since then, patiently waiting for the right moment to use whatever damaging information she eventually found." Vincent's expression remained tight with controlled fury as the damning evidence steadily accumulated on the screen directly in front of us, every fabricated timestamp and manipulated screenshot now clearly traceable back to one single source. "She planned this entire smear campaign carefully before I even knew Clyde was pregnant," he said quietly, almost speaking to himself. "She's been patiently waiting for an opportunity exactly like this for far longer than I initially realized." By early afternoon, Vincent had successfully assembled the entire executive board for an emergency meeting, determined to address these serious allegations directly rather than allow damaging speculation to fester any longer throughout the company. I stood nervously beside him at the front of the crowded conference room, my hands clasped tightly together to hide their visible trembling, while Martha sat quietly near the back, her expression completely unreadable as the meeting formally began. "I understand troubling rumors have circulated regarding my personal relationship with Clyde Mercer," Vincent began, his voice carrying the same commanding authority I had witnessed countless times during important business negotiations. "I want to address this matter directly right now. Clyde has never once manipulated me, never used this pregnancy as calculated leverage, and never sought anything beyond complete honesty throughout our entire relationship together. The damaging accusations circulating were deliberately fabricated by my former partner Velma Frost, who illegally accessed my private accounts specifically to construct false evidence against us. A ripple of stunned murmurs spread rapidly across the crowded room. The HR director stood up and carefully presented the detailed technical findings from our morning investigation, methodically walking the entire board through clear evidence of digital tampering, manipulated timestamps, and confirmed unauthorized access dating back several months prior. Slowly, visibly, the obvious skepticism in the room began shifting steadily towards something considerably closer to genuine sympathy for our situation. When the lengthy meeting finally adjourned, complete exhaustion settled over me so heavily that I barely registered Martha approaching until she was standing directly in front of me, her expression noticeably softer than I had seen at any single point since we had first met. "You stood your ground today the exact same way you did at dinner," she said, studying my face carefully. "Most people in your particular position would have completely crumbled under this kind of intense pressure. You didn't crumble at all. I simply had too much to lose by staying silent," I admitted honestly to her. "I think," she continued slowly, choosing each word with obvious careful consideration, "I may have seriously misjudged you initially, Clyde. I sincerely apologize for that mistake on my part." It wasn't an elaborate declaration of complete acceptance, but coming directly from Martha Sheridan, it felt like an actual earthquake shifting the entire foundation of everything I had previously assumed about my place within this powerful family. That evening, Vincent and I stood quietly together on his apartment balcony, the sprawling city stretching endlessly below us in a glittering expanse of golden light. His arm wrapped securely around my waist, his palm resting gently against the small, barely noticeable curve of my stomach beneath my sweater. "We actually survived all of it," I said softly, leaning back comfortably against his solid chest. "The lies, the public accusations, your mother's relentless interrogation, all of it together. We genuinely did," he agreed, pressing a soft, lingering kiss against my temple. "And we're going to keep surviving absolutely everything else life decides to throw at us going forward, because that's simply what we do now. Together as one unit." "Promise me something important," I said, turning slightly in his arms to look directly up at him. "Anything you want, Clyde. Promise our child will never once grow up wondering if they were some kind of mistake or merely an obligation or anything less than completely and entirely wanted by both of us." His expression softened instantly into something achingly tender, his hand cradling the side of my face with a gentleness that erased every single fear I had carried since the very day this entire journey began. "I promise you completely," he said quietly, his voice steady and sure. "Our child will grow up knowing exactly how deeply they were wanted by both of us right from the very beginning of everything." When he kissed me again that night, every lingering doubt that had haunted me since first discovering those two pink lines finally dissolved completely away, replaced instead by something steady and certain that I had genuinely never quite believed I deserved to feel. The road ahead of us certainly wouldn't be effortless, and I understood that truth more deeply than ever, after everything we had just endured together. But standing there wrapped securely in his arms with the city lights glittering endlessly below us, I finally allowed myself to truly believe that whatever challenges still remained ahead, we would face every single one of them honestly, together, without any secrets ever standing between us again.